Coffeezilla got to interview the man again.
I tricked Sam Bankman-Fried into a third interview with me, and this time he may have admitted to fraud. You'll be the judge. You can click to this timestamp.
Wait, admitted?
If you just want to listen to the interview, but I want to explain the background, the strategy that went into this call to try to learn where others had failed, including, by the way, learning from my own failures interviewing Sam. Now, first, I want to give some background. Sam at no point has wanted to talk to me. Every time I've kind of snuck on these Q&As and started peppering him with questions, he usually leaves.
Why not?
But I realized that since this was my third time basically doing the exact same trick, it was probably going to be one of my last, because at some point he was going to catch on. So I knew going into this, it might be my last chance to interview Sam. And because of that, I had to think long and hard about what the perfect line of questioning would be to really pin Sam down, knowing that he's a master at dodging questions. He's done it with everybody so far, including me, by the way. And I mean, look, I think we've got some great stuff, but to this point, I didn't think anyone had gotten that smoking gun. He always denies everything. He always has a sort of a loophole out of it. So I'd have to try a different tactic. And here was my plan. Sam's whole excuse about not being a con man all hinges around Alameda Research. Basically, he says he knew nothing of what was going on there because he was just the CEO of FTX. And while that's nearly impossible to believe that he's this stupid or incompetent, it's really hard to prove 100%. So I realized if we were going to do this, I'd have to remove Alameda from my case, right? I needed to show that Sam had knowingly defrauded people without invoking Alameda at any point. And here was my plan to do it. I was going to spend the entire time laser focused on the FTX.
Have you seen the latest Batman movie? The one with Robert Pattinson? If so, yes. Very good, very good.
Terms of service. Entire time laser focused on the FTX terms of service. Now, some of you may know FTX lays out that they cannot use customer funds for anything. They can't trade with them. They can't loan them out. And I thought this was a really important point because obviously that money is no longer there. So clearly something must have happened. But I'm far from the first person to notice this. Many people, including myself, have already tried to ask him about this and pin him down. But for various reasons, well, it didn't work. And I needed to learn why so we could avoid it. So I want to go through a few major interviews with Sam and show why this line of questioning has always fallen apart, starting with the New York Times.
The terms of service for FTX, and I just want to read you this. It says, none of the digital assets in your account are the property of or shall or may be loaned to FTX Trading. FTX Trading does not represent or treat digital assets in users' accounts as belonging to FTX Trading. So how is it possible that Alameda had this loan of such a large size?
So there's
just ended up there.
Terms of service, but there were a number of other parts of the terms of service and a number of other parts of the platform on top of that. There is the borrow lending facility, where users were lending billions of dollars of assets to each other, collateralized by assets on the exchange. You had obviously futures contracts where there are leveraged positions on. Now, of course, all of this, it's meant to be the case that these are positions where FTX could, if it needed to, margin call those positions and close them down in time such that it would cover all of those, all those shorts, all those liabilities. Obviously, that wasn't the case here, and that's a massive failure of oversight, of risk management, and of diffusion of responsibility from myself running FTX.
But just make this very straight. Was there commingling of funds? That's what it appears like. It appears like there's been a genuine commingling of the funds that FTX customers
is a yes or no.
That were not supposed to be commingled with your separate firm.
I didn't knowingly commingle funds.
Okay,
knowingly.
Sorkin tried and failed here to pin him down on the terms of service.
Bro still tried to dance out of it.
Because Sam escapes in this talk about a different part of the terms of service, which related to margin trading, where you take out some kind of a loan. And in a way, it was a complete deflection. It doesn't matter that
it didn't
separate
matter.
margin
It's
trading
like
in terms of service, because the people who weren't margin trading still should have had their funds kept safe. But it sort of threw Sorkin off track. And so now we're going to move to the Stephanopoulos interview, which was a bit better because Sam's going to try the margin trading story. But watch Stephanopoulos. He does a better job at honing in on the question.
But as you know, the FTX terms of service
Yep.
tell the people who signed up none of the digital assets in your account are the property of or shall be or may be loaned to FTX Trading. But you're saying that happened.
My understanding is a few things happen. The first is there is a margin trading facility on FTX by which users can lend out funds, by which other users borrow funds. And so there are explicit cases where there is, margin extended, where there is borrow lending.
If Alameda is borrowing the money that belongs
Yep.
to FTX depositors, that's a bright red line, isn't it?
There are a lot of cases where that's actually explicitly part of the programs and that are
But
happening.
not
and people
here.
are
Here it
opting.
says that the digital assets may not be
No,
loaned to
no.
FTX Trading.
No.
They can't be loaned out.
Oh.
There existed a borrow lending facility on FTX. And I think that's probably covered, I don't
dance.
remember exactly where, but somewhere else in the terms of service.
But they'd have to approve of that. They're saying they didn't approve of it here. They're saying you approved of it.
Now, this is great
You'd
stuff
have
from
to do it,
Stephanopoulos.
yeah.
He refocused the question, but Sam's about to weasel out with a new trick. Go ahead and watch.
Oh no.
If you
Another one.
rewind to the beginning of FTX, where some customers were I think in line with sort of existing relationships that they've had, at least in some cases, wiring money straight to Alameda Research in order to trade on FTX.
So you do
Well, he's
know,
saying
and
other
you
people-
did know that
people just did it.
FTX deposits were being funneled to Alameda.
So I was vaguely aware that that was how some wires were being sent in the first place.
Didn't that set off alarm
Now
bells
he's
in your head?
vaguely aware.
So there are a lot of people who are involved in that process. And look, I really deeply wish that I had taken like a lot more responsibility for understanding what the details were of what was going on there.
This is how he slips out again.
Boy.
He tried the margin trading explanation.
no way.
It didn't work. So he pivots to,
Still
okay, well,
crazy.
there's this weird backstory where FTX used to take wires from Alameda. And maybe that's where we lost the money, right? It's another smokescreen.
Yeah,
but
like, he's really not
unfortunately,
saying
it kind of
anything.
hamstrung the conversation. And if I was
He's
going to
still just
I'd have to
dancing.
beat that explanation. And in the first couple interviews I did with Sam, I tried to go with like this insider angle, where insiders I had talked to had told me something very different, but it didn't work. Go ahead and watch.
There's sort of all this talk about the terms of service. Did you break terms of
Right,
service?
he got
Not.
around pretty well
You're
here.
basically claiming that there was this separate side of your terms of service. But I talked to somebody from Alameda.
He is getting around pretty well here, but it is interesting to see that he now admitted to say he genuinely did know, whether it's just a small part, he did know a little bit that Alameda was involved at some point, which is very interesting. He was holding up on that hill that did not know, and now he's saying, I knew a little bit. It started at the beginning. I knew a little bit. That's interesting.
And asked how big the position of or how many people.
Also, the thing that blows my brain is that like he's saying like there was a part in here that absolutely made me fucking die. There's a part where he's saying that the funds that were given to Alameda don't really matter because the customers don't mind. The idea of like a lot of these tokens and shit and whatnot is that like their money isn't being messed with, moved around with. It was being
Had assets
moved
in
that
the
way.
type of accounts that
It's
that
kinda
terms
funny.
of service would apply
It's
to
just
versus the
kinda
regular
funny,
terms
man.
of service, which said you couldn't use their money.
ironic.
And they said it was about $1 billion that was in the margin trading or the margin side of things, where you could reuse their funds or whatever, and the rest of it was not there. So it seems like you're putting all your eggs behind this one excuse about, there was this separate side of the terms of service. How do you address
So there's
everyone
a separate,
else?
he's saying. Oh.
So, I don't have all the data in front of me. My memory is that it was substantially more than $1 billion. I can't verify that. On top of that, there were other effects as well. Some of those were early wire transfers sent directly to Alameda.
Yeah, I kind of got stuck where Stephanopoulos roughly got stuck. I should have known that he was just going to refuse the evidence of insiders and just say, well, I disagree, and go back to his Alameda wire explanation. And I tried following it up a bit, but it didn't really matter. I had kind of missed my shot on that particular angle. And as I reflected on this, I realized all of the talk about margin trading, future trading, wire transfers to Alameda, all of it is a smokescreen from the big problem. The big problem is that some percentage of FTX's customer base never sent a wire to Alameda. They never signed up to margin trading. They never did spot margin. All they did was put their assets on the platform. And
They
were
just
told
used
that
FTX.
their assets would not be borrowed.
Right.
It would not be loaned out. And that money would always be there.
Right.
And it wasn't there.
Exactly.
Why
That's
wasn't
weird.
it there? There's no other way to explain that. If the money's not there, then fraud. And I had to laser in on that one point, not get distracted by these shiny objects that Sam's throwing up about this or that, or what about this, what about that? No, there's only one question that matters, and it's impossible for him to answer, I thought. So that was my strategy going into it. That was the backstory and how I learned from previous interviews. So without further ado, here's my third and probably final call with Sam Bankman-Fried.
I'm about to go up.
The finale.
Okay, Coffee, you're up.
Hey Sam, it's me again. I just wanted to ask real quick about the terms of service question, which Rect brought up a little bit. I want to expound on it. Can you just tell us, yes or no, were you treating client assets just on the regular digital asset side different from the margin trading side?
I do think we were treating them differently. There were a bunch of different sides, or more than two sides there.
Easy.
But I do think that
It's okay.
that we were cognizant of the fact that like there were differences between uses for like, you know, margin versus staking versus spot versus futures collateral versus other things.
Yeah, just people. I'm just talking about people just you know, putting Bitcoin on the exchange.
Yeah.
Obviously, there was really clear terms of service around that. If it's true that you didn't invest client assets, not even in treasuries, as you said via a now deleted tweet, why do those client assets no longer exist?
So I'm trying to trace through some of this. Here's my best guess, and I wish I could give you a more confident answer, but I don't have the data. But my best guess is basically it's a combination of the following. One piece is the transfer sent directly to Alameda Research from customers. One piece, and that I think is a fairly substantial piece.
But doesn't always talk about, right?
Wait, can you explain what that piece means? So people were sending money to Alameda instead of, they were getting credited on FTX, and Alameda just ended up using those funds, and they were never held separately per the terms of service.
Well, there was a separate legal agreement with that. I don't know the details of it. I don't have it in front of me, but there's a separate legal agreement with respect to transfers that were sent directly to Alameda Research by users, especially before FTX had its own bank accounts. And so I do think that is part of what happened there, likely.
Let's focus on only client assets that happened after FTX got a bank. Y'all said digital assets are treated a very specific way. Why were those digital assets not treated that way?
So of the remaining piece, and there's a few other pieces as well around features and other things. I understand that's not what you're talking about. For the ones that you are talking
gonna say
about,
that's
right,
random.
for the ones that were left, and I'm just taking a stab at this because I don't have the data, but my best guess is the following, is that there were a lot of those assets remaining. We processed something like $5 or $6 billion, I think, of withdrawals over the few days prior to, or I guess the few days during the crash, and there are still a few $1 billion of those remaining, I think, in the estate. And so you put those together, you have many billions of dollars of those assets. But I think, and so that's part of the answer, is that there were a large number of actual assets there. I think there's one follow-up question you probably still have there, which is, well, how about people who didn't withdraw and were also in that bucket?
Yeah.
And part of the answer is, well, there still do exist some number of billions of dollars of assets, of hard assets in the estate.
No, is there one-to-one assets? Because that's the whole thing. We're talking about a separation of funds. So those funds should be in a different place, in a different wallet than everybody else. What you talked about, servicing billions of dollars of withdrawals, has nothing to do with those specific digital assets, because that's just first come, first serve, whoever pulled out first. We're talking about people who never agreed to have their funds loaned out, who never agreed to have their funds put on margin. They should have, according to your terms of service, one-to-one backing.
Man's on a
it
mission
should
this
all
time.
still be in some bucket somewhere. And are you confident today, as the CEO of FTX, this has nothing to do with Alameda, are you confident today to say that those are absolutely real and they exist and they're present, people are backed one-to-one on client digital assets?
So I think, and again, I'm just taking a stab here, but I think what happened is that if you look at especially a lot of the withdrawals that happened, those withdrawals were not necessarily only coming from people who never used margin trading or futures or staking or anything else. Those weren't just withdrawals from people who were keeping one-to-one backed, or were sort of just keeping them as pure spot balances. And it was omnibus wallets, between the various categories. And so I think that the answer to your question is that a number of those assets were withdrawn by people who had balances on the exchange, potentially in the few days prior to the collapse. And if you wanted to think about it this way, it could be that that happened, and then when the collapse sort of completed, that effectively meant that there was, if you wanted to put it this way, like fungibility created during those withdrawals between assets for people who had and had not been using.
But that means that there is no separation of funds. If there's fungibility between two different buckets of there are no buckets. It's just one bucket.
It's just a big old bucket.
Everyone's taking out of the bucket, which means substantially anyone who had your terms of service with digital assets wasn't actually subject to that terms of service. They were subject to the same terms of service of your margin trading, right? Which is your more risky product. So you subjected everyone to the higher risk product because fundamentally, when it came down to it, you're saying there's fungibility. It's $1 here, $1 there. Everyone can take out $1 as fast as they want. Don't you see that as like defrauding your customers, the people who trusted you to just say, hey, this is not going to go anywhere except for we're not investing your assets? If I can exchange one-to-one, and I'm the one who put risky stuff on with risky assets with risky terms of service, I can take the money that someone who didn't sign up to those same risky terms didn't agree to.
Oh man,
Isn't
he is
that
so
fraud?
on point right now.
So,
jeez. Because these are
I'm specifically talking
he's
about
leading
what
this
happened
convo so well. He's not
days
falling for the dances today.
immediately,
Like this
during
man
and
is
following
trying to
the collapse.
dance. This man is trying to dance really hard, but the man is catching all the right shit and sticking on the path.
In that 3 or so day period, and during that period, I think we may have allowed just generalized withdrawals. I think that was
It's crazy that he can say it like it's no big deal though. That's what was crazy to me. Like he still plays this off like oops. Like it's just a little accident. All the accounts are in the same bucket where they all kind of have the same risks, even though they didn't sign up for the same risks. Like he's like oops, oopsie. It's just kind of like, it's so weird.
if you're saying that we should have held up withdrawals for everyone who had an open futures position, for clawback potential or something like that. I don't know, maybe that would have been the right thing to do. I hear where you're coming from on that. I felt, at the time, that, we wanted to treat customers equally. It was an incredible...
But they had agreed to different things, so you can't treat them
what?
equally. I mean, it's like, this is the whole problem of the story of FTX and Alameda, is all the funds were being commingled. Isn't this just another story of commingling funds, except this is now
That's
FTX,
right.
which you can't pass the blame to Alameda anymore. This is your company, your funds, that you are treating all the clients the same when they clearly signed up to different terms of service.
So, I just want to respond to that, and please, I completely respect your question, but you have monopolized all of these discussions, Coffeezilla. You need to let others speak, and you need to respond to what I'm saying and not grandstand as much here.
Hey.
I completely understand where you're coming from.
Bro, the man's like, please respond to my dances. Please follow my dance. You're not following my dance. What are you doing? This is not it. This man is not liking what's going on here.
To answer your question, I didn't make a decision there. We processed withdrawals as we normally do until it became clear we couldn't anymore, at which point we shut them off. And it was the case that, like, at that point, there was a big liquidity hole. That's what happened. If you want to judge that process and think that, like, we should have been spending those days frantically trying to code up a new withdrawal process, I disagree with you, but I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, sure. I think that's fine. I mean, it's not about coding up a new withdrawal process. It's about treating your client assets the way you told them they'd be treated, right? It's a very different thing. Completely. But anyways, I'll stop grandstanding for Sam. Thanks, guys.
This time he left.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, he didn't really need any more.
Woo!
Didn't really need any more than that.
Oh my gosh. Wow. We got the call out. We got the shout out. All right. You can probably tell I was pretty excited about that because I finally got what I was looking for. A straight answer on the problem of funds, right? Sam explicitly says that FTX was not separating funds. They were allowing generalized withdrawals. The dollars were fungible from different buckets. You can't do that. We finally dodged all the BS about margin trading, about Alameda wires.
He didn't like that
finally
either.
got to the heart of it, which is that there are no funds left over for the people who just should have had their funds separated because they never separated them from the beginning.
Right.
They were always seemingly commingled. And although Sam wouldn't necessarily agree that they were always commingled, the proof is in the pudding.
Yeah,
to give you
like-
kind of a regular finance analogy about
You
why
can't
this
really-
is so cataclysmically bad. And
You can't really argue that that's not how it goes when all signs lead to that. It's kind of hard.
seemingly commingled. And although Sam wouldn't necessarily agree that they were always commingled, the proof is in the pudding.
Yep.
To give you kind of a regular finance analogy about why this is so cataclysmically bad, and in my opinion, fraud. Imagine you banked at JP Morgan Chase, right? And you have your money in the savings account part. Well, then you find out that they actually had this risky hedge fund. And you know what? They actually kind of blew up. In fact, they blew up so badly that JP Morgan Chase, it's all shutting down. But when you go to the bank to withdraw your money, you find out that instead
They
of
put
keeping
it all
your money
in the
safely
thingy.
in your savings account, they had allowed the people in the hedge fund business to just withdraw it, you know, first come, first serve, right? They treated all clients the same, according to them. Well, you say, well, no, that's fraud because you signed up to very different terms of service than the guy who knew he was going to be like, you know, in this hedge fund, right? He had a different level of risk. He acknowledged that level of risk. And if you just throw all the money in one pot, the terms of service are meaningless, right? You're exposed to the same level of risk as the guy who took on huge risk. And that's fundamentally what happened at FTX. That's fraud. They told people their money was safe, and ultimately, they just subjected everyone to the same risk as like the day trading degenerate gambler on 100x leverage. And I really found the last thing
crazy.
Sam told me like so telling.
To answer your question, I didn't make a decision there. We processed withdrawals as we normally do. That's what happened. If you want to judge that process and think that like we should have been spending those days frantically trying to code up a new withdrawal process, I disagree with you, but I understand where you're coming from.
This is so interesting because no, of course I don't think you should be coding up a new withdrawal process while you're going bankrupt. But if throwing all your client funds in a pool and letting the first come first serve get the money, that's the wrong process to begin with.
True, you
your
should
process
probably-
was fraudulent from the start. It should have never been your
true.
process. Your process should have been what you promised clients, which is of
True.
course what I told Sam. And although I think Sam's probably guilty of a lot more than we covered
Pretty much
here,
what I was gonna say.
I really wanted to
True.
get to this minimum viable fraud case, and I think we did get it. I mean, there is no sort of wiggling around the fact that he was the CEO of FTX, and all of this stuff that was bad that we proved happened at FTX. You don't have to invoke Alameda to get to this, so you can't say he didn't know, because he definitely did know, and he says he
True.
knew. So the last thing I'm going to close on, and I thought it was the funniest part, was his little outburst at the end about me monopolizing his time.
So
Right.
I just want to respond to that. And please, I completely respect your question, but you have monopolized all of these discussions, Coffeezilla. You need to let others speak, and you need to respond to what I'm saying and not grandstand
What he
as
is
much
saying.
here.
What
And I
I
thought it was notable for two reasons. One, he hasn't lost his cool once in any interview. This is the first time I heard him like really crack. And I thought that was interesting, but I also thought it was interesting because it's just not true. It's totally wrong. I've talked to Sam for I think 30 minutes across 3 interviews total, like in total. And for context, he gave the New York Times an hour. He gave George Stephanopoulos 2 hours. I think out of everyone he's talked to, or at least of the major interviews, I've talked to him the least. So if anything, I'm efficient with my time. That's all I'm going to say.
Speed
And
running.
speaking of being efficient with my time, this video is over. Lock this man up, and I'll see you later. Thanks for watching.
Jeez. Well, that was quite interesting. I guess that do be the finale for now. It was quite crazy. Finally got the man to just come out and admit some things and explain the process and whatnot.